So today's topic is mass media policy and committees. So module, uh, by the end of this module, we should be able to know about the communication system in India, communication policy, and its importance in giving direction to the process of development and change, and formulation of mass media policy in India, recommendations of various committees appointed by the government. So that is the scope for today's presentation. So let me start with the communication system. So most of our communication takes place in the media. So the communication technology has equipped us to overcome these constraints of distance and time. So in that way, the media helps for most of the communication to take place. So it's we have to accept this. No one can deny this. Most of our communication takes place in the media. So technology enables us to interact with each other without being in face-to-face situation. So this is just a uh, introduction for what is the communication system is about. So it's what we call as mediated communication. So the mediated communication exposes to varied experiences to make us aware of new people, new group, new things, and new events. So here the point is technology enables us to interact with each other without being in face-to-face situations. So that is one of the notable point in communication system. We go see mass media are a very important component of a society. Nobody can avoid a mass media in a society in some way. We all what you say linked or connected with the mass media as from the ages, from various stages. So mass media is a very important component of society. Their usage, so their usage is tremendous in our country, like developing countries. It's considered as to be the most crucial in the challenge to mobilize people for development activities. So since, as I said, the developing country like us, most of the development activities can be, be reach the people, reach the public through this mass media. So it is very crucial, most crucial for the medium, and it is a challenge to mobilize the people for the development activities. So that's why in the development, the mass media is a very important or a very important component of society. So therefore, there should be a communication policy. So if you want to connect all these three, any communicate distance and time constraints are overcome by this communication, and most of our communication takes place in the media and technology mediated communication. We are getting varied experience with aware of new people, new events, and new things. So here the technology enables us to interact. And finally, the important point to be considered why the policy has to be framed is mass media is a very important component of this society. So there should be a communication policy, and more specifically, a mass media policy in each country, because the policy should give direction to the programs which are channeled through various mass media networks. So we need a policy. Because of these reasons, communication technology is a part of a society. So define. So let me go to the next slide, defining communication policy. So a policy, first before that we will see, a policy is a set of principles, rules and guidelines to help in the tackling of problems which will be faced by a society in any particular field. So here are some definition I have taken to explain or to define a policy. So if you want to see a policy, it's a set of principles, rules and guidelines which helps to tackle the problems faced by the society in any field, any particular field. A social policy would facilitate the framing and implementation of action programs to solve social problems. Since the mass media is connected with a very important component of the society, so it's need a social policy which would really which would facilitate the framing and implementation of action programs to solve the social problems. So in the same way, communication policy is formulated in responses to the challenges of new communication technologies. So we can define a communication policy as action oriented principles outlining objectives and means of achieving those objectives. So, focusing on what needs to be done and what is to be avoided in dealing with the current and anticipated communication problems in the society has to be included in this policy formation. So, the policies are formulated as what you say, the authoritative guidelines by the legitimate bodies for what? Developing, maintaining, utilizing, regulating, and changing the mass media systems. So the policy has to be formulated by the, it is an authoritative guideline for developing, maintaining, utilizing, and regulation, changing in the mass media system. So it's not an easy task, and because we have a different mass media system across the age and across various levels. So policy making is a complex, dynamic process involving different kinds of inputs. Scientific knowledge from theoretical and empirical research. Social wisdom expressed by philosophers, scholars, and leaders engaged in different areas of social activities, and valid opinions expressed by the public. So, why this has to be the scientific knowledge from theoretical and research oriented, the social wisdom by the philosophers? So, the policy making is a complex process and a dynamic process which involves these kinds of inputs for the betterment, for the better development of the society, which should consider the scientific knowledge from the theories and the philosophy, which the focus has to be the social wisdom to be incorporated, and the leaders engaged in different areas of social activities, and there can what you say, the notions has to be considered, and valid opinions expressed by the public. So that is the reason, after framing a policy, even considering the public opinion, since it's a mass medium. So it is obvious that to be an effective one. So the policy making process need to deal with a large volume of information from different sources. As I said, considering all these inputs, so it deals with a large volume of information from different sources, mostly processed and integrated for immediate use. So it's a immediate implementation of the policies for the mass media sector. So this is possible only when the society has a well-organized communication system. You can take it of any system like a radio, television, for example, now it's new medium. So this is possible only when the society has a well-organized communication system. So getting inputs from various various areas of science, theory, social wisdom, and the public's opinion. Okay. So here the role of communication policy. So if that is the case, after considering putting all the efforts with this large volume of information from different sources, and developing it into a communication policy. Yeah, just a minute. I think now it's visible. Okay. So the role of, then what is the role of communication policy? So given the centrality focus of communication in modern society, one should rightly expect the communication policy would have a distinct and independent role to play. So it should be a distinct one, an independent role to play in this modern society. It should be based on society's goals and expectations about the structures, functions, and needs and resources of communication. So it should be based on these aspects like structures, functions, and needs and resources of communication. So it would take into account the problems that crop up when using communication in varied activities. So that is the reason the committees keep on changing, and they used to advise, or they used to give some guidelines time to time. So, to shape a communication policy, three areas, three aspects. The communication problem has to be addressed, sectoral, social policies has to be considered, and what is the communication policy. See, if you see the communication problems, so these things has to be addressed in the communication system and the communication policy. Structural need, functional, and needs. So language oriented, regional, political, economy, regulations, cultural norms, technology. So considering all these inputs in all the aspects as we discussed earlier, the functional way of what is its function. So the function of any communication medium or any mass medium, information, education, entertainment, motivation, and persuasion. These are to be the functions of any mass medium. And needs. What is the need? First need is the recognition and expression and influence. So these communication problems are concerned with the process and product of communication. You see, first decide about the structure. How my medium has to be for television or radio. Language and regional wise it has to be considered, and the political economy has to be taken into account, and the regulations, cultural norms, and technology plays a role in this structural form of communication for formation, policy formation, which involves in the process and product of communication. So, this is a functional uh, aspect. What are the functions of different media? So, it should inform, it should educate, it should entertain, and it should motivate and persuade. So, needs, finally, the needs are it's getting recognition, expression, and influence among the audience or the targeted people. So, when it comes to sectoral social policies, what are the different sectors to be taken, considered by considering these problems addressed under structural, functional, and needs? Agricultural policies, it's the development. So these address some communication problems in an what you say, the fragmented manner, because uh, it involves with various what do you say, sectors. As said, it's a development oriented, so it involves with various sectors, and different sectoral policies have implications for communication policy. For example, it has to be incorporated, what you say, collaborated with this agricultural, industrial, science and technology, environment, population and health policy. Finally, the education, the cultural. So these are all the sectors that has to be considered while forming the policy for communication. So formulated on the basis of analysis of the totality of communication problems and communication goals of the society. So which takes account on the sectoral policies in utilizing communication in these sectors. As I said, agriculture, industrial, science and technology, export and import, environment, for health, population, education. So utilizing communication in those sectors, the sectoral policies has to be taken in account. So a prerequisite in providing information basis for society overall policy making on all problems. It has to address all the issues. So that's why the function won't change. It won't change mostly. The sectoral policies keep on changing time to time based on the development and requirement. So it should have. So that is the reason it should have a distinct and independent existence of a communication policy on its own by considering all other sectors, but it will have an intersectoral implications. So intersectoral role plays a major role in this communication policy formation. So considering with this background, moving towards the communication policy, what are the objectives of a communication policy? So the priorities according to which the developed countries is to formulate their policies differ. You see, it is not going to be same or uniform across uh, all the developing countries or developed countries. Okay, it is going to be differ, sometimes even contradict each other with the developed and developing countries. The technologically advanced countries like United States and Japan are concerned with mobilizing the world markets for the communication goods and services. They use this media to mobilize the world markets for their communication goods and products. So on the other hand, the developing countries like us, India, which are at the receiving end of the technology. So, and information transfer are concerned with building and expanding their communication system with the indigenous and appropriate technology. So that is the reason the priorities according to the developed and developing countries to formulate their policies differ and sometimes even contradict each other. So the manifest objective of the communication policy of developed countries is to safeguard the free and open flow of information the world over to ensure the public's access to varied points of view, while the developing nations seek to safeguard their societies from economic, cultural, and communication invasion by the developed nations. So, one major objective of their communication policy is to eliminate vestiges of colonial dependency. So, for their so the governments of developing countries demand balanced trade as well as news flow with the developed countries. So, that is equal flow of information. A major thrust area of communication policy of developing countries is the implementation of viable alternatives to the one-way flow of information into their societies. So the communication networks of developing countries are devoted to affirming and preserving the diverse cultural identities and reinforcing the ideology of national integration. So some developing countries can apparently afford to import complex communication systems which they hope will modernize their infrastructure in a short period. So here the objective is there should be a difference in with communication policy in the developed countries and developing countries. It is not like just adapting or of taking into consideration the developed countries policy, because their target and their requirement is totally different with the communication system and thing, and ours is totally different. But some developing countries are afford these importing these complex communication systems, which they hope that it will modernize their infrastructure in a short period. So that is the reason it varies across country to country, because it involves what you say, uh, the cultural, so it is a cultural carrier. So in some developing countries, we have to consider the economic, cultural, and communication innovation by the developed countries has to be safeguarded by this developing nation. That is going to be the one of the tasks. But people hope that system will modernize their infrastructure in a short period. So we'll see how it happens. So with the communication policy, the objective. So, so most of the developing countries are busy waging a constant battle against poverty, malnutrition, illiteracy, and indebtedness. Such countries are market for the exporters of communication technology, the developed countries. Thus, communication development receives a scarce priority in their national objectives. So that is the reason most developing countries know the uh, objectives, the communication development becomes a priority in their national objectives. So the chance to build a strong communication networks depends on the availability of foreign aid. So under these circumstances, communication policy debates center around the acceptance or rejection of financial and other assistance from developed countries. That is here the depends on the foreign policies. The main issues are not just the mobilizing of financial resources, transfer of technology, and development of the human resources for communication. There are more fundamental issues concerned with the basic role of communication in society. It is not mobilizing the financial resources or transferring the technology or development of human resources for communication. The more fundamental issues are the role of government, the role of government, the mode of financial communication, financing communication services, basic access to communication independent of the economic ability to pay for essential services, protection of the rights of the poor and disadvantaged, regulation of commercialism in communication, and harnessing of cultural resources through mediated communication and the mass media networks. So these are all the more fundamental issues that are concerned with the basic role of communication in society. So keeping this in mind, these are all the objectives of any communication policy that has to be formed in any country, like even a developed country or as well as the developing country. Keep this in mind. The things that has to be keep it to remember is totally different. Sometimes it differs, and sometimes it contradicts between developed and developing country, because it is going to be it should not be a cultural or economic or invasion or communication invasion by the developed country in the developing countries. So, in accordingly, it has to be. It is a cultural carrier in most of the developing countries, and that is not the case for the developed countries. The communication system varies. So, with this, our government, Indian government, has formed various committees, commissions and committees on the media to, as I said, time to time, to develop the communication policy for our country. So let us see the regulation. Sorry, students, there is a technical issue. So there is a problem in the power and also with the internet. So that is the reason. And now I think now I am connected.
Yes, sir.
Is it clear? Is it audible?
Sir.
Yes. Sorry for the inconvenience and thank you, thank you people for patiently waiting. So what we have seen so far is the objectives to frame a communication policy in a country. We have discussed what is a policy and what are the in how where to get different source of inputs to be considered to form a policy formation, and now we'll see what are the different commissions, committees on the media which framed in our country. So let us see the regulations that have been implemented by the government when initiating its policy for individual media like brush, press, radio, TV, and film. One of the first steps undertaken immediately after India gained independence was the setting up of a Press Law Enquiry Committee, 1947, to review the existing press laws. So the outcome of this Press Law Enquiry Committee was the passing of the Press Objectionable Matters Act, amending Article 19 plus 2 by adding various restrictions. So this was the outcome of this Press Law Enquiry Committee in 1947 to pass the passing of the Press Act amending article by adding various restrictions. So the government constituted the first press commission under the chairmanship of Justice G.S. Raja Dhyaksha on September 23, 1952. And the commission presented its report in 1954. So, among other recommendations, it advised the formation of a press council, a code of ethics, appointment of a press registrar, and a state trading corporation, minimal basic wages for working journalists, and the operation of price page schedule. So these are the recommendation advised. Another major committee to promote the growth of small newspapers called the Enquiry Committee on Small Newspapers. It was appointed under the chairmanship of P.R. Divakar, who, who submitted the report to the parliament on March 1956, March 9, 1956. So these are purely focused on the press regulations, plus formation, policy formation, and to review the existing laws in the press. So this was the first committee by in 1947 after India gained independence by the Press Law Inquiry Committee, and they have come up with various recommendations in their reports. So the notable recommendations by the first press commission with chairmanship of Raja Dhyaksha was formation of a press council, code of ethics for a press, and the appointment of press registrar, and it has a state trading corporation and wages for basic wages for working journalists and the operation of price page schedule. So time to time, various committees have been recruited to give up their observations and reports for development. So there is the necessity of expert committees. So there is an oft repeated charge that the government, for reasons itself not interested in framing a communication policies. Though policies have been announced in other sectors like agriculture, industry, education, health, and even tourism, public health. So the same has not been done in the case of mass media. It's not like as we discussed previously. It is an considering the intersectoral policy implication is there with the media, mass media policy or the communication policy. So this is not like the case of mass media for like other sectors like agriculture, industry, education, health, uh, and other sectorials. So this position can be summarized in what Mr. Indira Gandhi said on returning to power in 1980. It was necessary to keep control over AIR and TV to correct the imbalance created by the free press. It is a notable period. Indira Gandhi, returning to power in 1980, she said it was necessary to keep control over holiday radio and television to correct the imbalance created by the free press. So there should be a committee, there should be a policy guideline how a press should be acted. So ultimate thing is to have a control over these two major media organizations, media units in our country, All India Radio and Television, which will correct the imbalance that created by the free press people outside. So let us now see the recommendation of some of the committees appointed by the central government to advise it on the form, structure, ownership, and content of broadcasting in India. So here I have listed out some four committees: Chanda Committee, Kuldeep Nair Committee, Varghese Committee, Working Group on Software. So during Mrs. Indira Gandhi's tenure as the Union Minister, yeah, the Chanda Committee. Um, just a minute, Chanda. A.K. Chanda Committee was appointed in 1964 during Mrs. Indira Gandhi tenure as the Union Minister for Information and Broadcasting. The A.K. Chanda Committee was appointed. It submitted its report in 1966, which was tabled in Parliament in only in 1970. So the committee they recommended the liberation of radio and television from rigid government control by converting them into separate corporations. So that was one of the notable recommendation given by the committee. So liberation of radio and television from rigid government control by converting them into separate corporations like Akashawani, Doordarshan. So that's how it took another 6 years to separate Doordarshan from Akashwani to create Akashwani and Doordarshan, which is separated in 1976. Though both function under the same administrative and financial procedures with the common engineering and program staff cadres, they have been separated as Akashwani and Doordarshan as two separate corporations. It's not become under the direct control by the government. So it's an autonomous body, Akashwani and Doordarshan. The second Press Trust of India and UNI and Hindustan Samachar and Samachar Bharati were emerged in February 1970s, and one way news agency, our own news agency Samachar was formed. So the Kuldeep Nair Committee, the second committee which was appointed in 1977 on the constitutional and legal fronts, the 1975 to 77, which was an emergency, and the Janata Party during 1977 to 79, they heralded a fresh look at the mass media issues like restructuring of the National News Agency and the granting of autonomy of the broadcasting media. So what you say, the four national news agencies, PTI and UNI, which is English, and Hindustan Samachar and Samachar Bharati, which is Hindi, were merged on 1976, and one news agency was formed, which is they named as Samachar. So because this is after whenever the government changes, they go for a major restructuring of the committee, what you say, the reconstruction of the media units here by the Janata Party during 1977. No, no, they're restructuring the national news agencies. They just merged into a single one news agency, which is called as Samachar. So after the emergency, the Kuldeep Nair committee was appointed in 1977. It recommended the dissolution of Samachar and suggested the creation of two news agencies, Varta in Hindi and other Indian languages, and Sandesh in English. So plus an international news agency, News India. So they keep on recommending. You see, every news committee, they keep on recommending things. So they recommended to dissolution of Samachar. So, but the Kuldeep Nair committee report was rejected. So the next committee, Varghese committee. Meanwhile, the Janata government appointed a working group on autonomy for Akashvani and Doordarshan in August 1977. It is headed by B.G. Varghese, which submitted its recommendation on February 24, 1978. But the main suggestion of the Varghese committee, the formation of Akash Bharati or National Broadcasting Trust for both All India Radio and Doordarshan, did not find any favor even with the Janata rulers. So, explaining the background to these bold recommendations, P.G. Varghese later said the reason why the people want an independent corporation is because the executive, abetted by a captive parliament, shamelessly misused broadcasting during the emergency. That is what has to be prevented for all time. This is the explain the background for a recommendation of this two trust. So democracy is not something based on the pillar of only one institution, such as parliament or the judiciary, however important it may be. So it's a woven out of many institutions of which a free, responsible, and creative broadcasting system. It's one of the most significant. So based on this background, the BG Varghese has recommended, and the Varghese committee report was tabled in both the houses of parliament, and finally L.K. Advani, the then Minister for Information and Broadcasting, introduced a bill on May 16, 1979. So the bill proposed the setting up of an autonomous corporation known as Prasar Bharati for both All India Radio and television. But it substantially altered the basic structure of the proposed corporation as suggested by the Varghese committee and rejected the provisions of constitutional safeguards. But on the untimely dissolution of the Lok Sabha, the bill died a natural death. So it happens. They will submit, they will be formed under one government and they will be submitting their report on the other government. Obviously, they will be favoring points could be taken, consider, and some of the points like constitutional safeguards have been rejected by, submitted by the Varghese committee. So this is the situation of the Varghese committee, what has happened. And the fourth committee working group on software, for the Congress government back power in 1979, autonomy for All India Radio and Doordarshan was not considered necessary to enable these mass media to discharge their basic objectives of swaying the people. So the government appointed in 1982 a working group with Dr. P.C. Joshi as chairman to prepare a software plan for Doordarshan. So the working group in its report submitted in 1984 emphasized the lack of functional freedom. So it suggested reorganization of the Information and Broadcasting Ministry and the Railway Board pattern, insisted that it should be similarly manned only by people with professional experience. So this is one of the notable recommendation given by the suggestion given by the working group on software committee, which under the chairmanship of Dr. P.C. Joshi. The other committees also related to media, the Media Foundation of the Non-Aligned undertook in 1986 a national feedback project on Doordarshan, held 6 seminars in different metropolitan cities. On the basis of the consensus that emerged at various centers, it advocated that a television authority of India as a public trust set by and under the benign scrutiny of the parliament and government by experienced professionals and broad-minded persons of national stature with acclaimed scientific, technical, cultural, artistic, and aesthetic backgrounds was thought to be ideal. So these are all what you said, the media foundation for non-aligned. So media, NAMEDI. The issue of autonomy was also considered by the Sarkaria Commission in 1987. So from the different opinions gathered from various state governments and the intelligence in all parts of the country, the commission established there was a much of political interference in the working of the electronic media. It obviously it would be there, and we'll see the working structure and functions of the committee's recommendations and the formation of the Prasar Bharati. So after it assumed power in 1989, the national government, front government, came out first with a cabinet paper and then introduced the Prasad Bharati bill in December 1989. So according to Upendra, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, the bill borrowed from the Prasad Bharati bill of 1979 took into account the changed circumstance of the present ethos. Many, however, felt that bill was put before the nation in a hurry. So a national debate was initiated, in many cases with the active encouragement of the government, to arrive at a consensus of framework and the modalities for media autonomy. So then and there, it was repeatedly recommended and suggested by various committee. The notable thing is media autonomy. So the bill, after incorporating some amendments, was unanimously passed in both houses of the parliament. While there was no official pronouncement, so the dissolution of the Lok Sabha in April 1991 signed the death warrant of this Prasad Bharati bill, which then had needed by the president assent to becoming a law. So the death of Rajiv Gandhi and the advent of Congress rule in 1991 under P.V. Narasimha Rao put an end to any hopes about this issue. So the question of broadcasting autonomy, meanwhile, the question of broadcasting autonomy has become irrelevant as other sources, information and entertainment. The private corporation, the private channels entered Star TV, CNN, BBC have burst into view in the wake of the Gulf War, which we saw in the growth of television in India. So the invasion from the skies has begun by this television's responsibility to the country. So this is how the as a intro a brief about the Prasad Bharati, and we have seen just a brief about the various committees and various policy recommendations, some of the acceptance and some what are the factors that have been rejected by the policies that are recommended by various committees time to time. So what we have seen today is the communication as a system, how it works, and the need for communication policy and its importance, and its giving direction to the process of development and change, and formulation of mass media policy in India by various committees and commissions, recommendations of various committees appointed by the various governments after independence. That's what we have seen today. So this will help you to give a overall idea about the mass media policy and different committees in with a brief introduction. Okay, that's it for today.